Well, welcome in everyone to the Storycraft Cafe. I am your host, Hank Garner. Today, I'm super excited to have Snowden Wright joining me on the show to talk about his brand new book. It's called The Queen City Detective Agency, and it debuts, I think it's in August of this year. Is that right,
August.
Snowden?
That's
Yeah.
correct.
I've had an advance copy of the book for about a month now from your publisher. Absolutely love it. It's a lot of fun. And since I'm broadcasting live from the Queen City, Meridian, Mississippi, this is going to be a fun chat to have. So, welcome to the show, Snowden.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. I love to start the show with a fun question to kind of set the tone and to get the conversation started. And one question that I love to ask people is, what is your first memory of wanting to be a writer or storyteller?
I've thought about this a lot over the years. I
Yeah.
grew up in Meridian, and for a lot of my youth, there was no bookstore in town. So what we would do is on weekends, my dad would take me into Jackson, Mississippi,
Yeah.
to Lemuria, where they have a world-class bookstore.
Yeah.
That was the closest thing I had to a world-class bookstore. I mean, up to a bookstore, a hometown bookstore. And back in those days, Lemuria was on the second floor, and on the first floor, there was a little sports bar. And so my dad would give me a $20 bill and send me upstairs to pick out a book while he would have a couple scotches and watch the game. And so I like to say that I have two things to thank for the fact that I'm a writer: Lemuria Books and Johnny Walker Black.
And those things have probably crossed paths a number of times.
A few times, yeah.
Yeah, a few times. Yeah, that's so much fun. Growing up in Meridian, in Mississippi, we have an interesting history with books and writers, and there's this southern thing about storytelling.
Mm.
What do you think it is that makes southern writers such great storytellers, or southern people in general?
I think what makes people good storytellers is conflict, and that's what makes a
Yeah,
good story. And so
yeah,
Mississippi and the South at large has a lot of conflict, and we have a lot of history, and we have a troubled past, a fraught past, and dealing with that allows us to just know what conflict is, and we interrogate our history through storytelling, and that's how we cope with it. And it's really, it's nothing to be proud of until you translate that fraught history into storytelling. And we've produced some of the greatest writers in this country. I say that writers are Mississippi's greatest natural resource. And so
yeah.
some people have granite, some people have oil. We've got writers.
We have writers, musicians. If there's a way to encapsulate the pain, the joy,
Mm.
the heartache, and the celebration. And that's it's this interesting gumbo.
Mm-hmm.
Where the product is much bigger, more powerful than its individual parts, and that that's the story of humanity, but Southern humanity especially.
That's true. Absolutely.
Yeah,
And just on a hot day, which we have a lot of those in Mississippi, you're sitting on a
yeah,
porch, you got nothing to do except tell stories.
right,
And that's why we're used to it.
right. What was from those early days at Lemuria, and soaking in stories that way? What was it that made you want to tell your own stories? What most people, I've done more than 1,500 author interviews over the last decade, and I can count on my two hands the amount of writers who said, all I've ever wanted to do was be a writer, and I went to college and I pursued a creative writing focus, and this is all I've ever done. I can count on two hands the amount of people that is their story. Most people have a bit of a circuitous route. They go and they collect some life experience over here, they collect some stories over here, and they work different odd jobs and things, and then one day the switch goes off or something, and they feel like, now I have a story to tell. What has your experience been?
For me, the reason I'm a writer is that I was always first and foremost a reader, and I wanted to produce this thing that I enjoyed so much. And then when you're young, you start thinking about what you would like to be when you grow up. Some people
Yeah,
want to be an astronaut, some people want to be a doctor. Being a writer allowed me to be everything. I get to lead so many different lives through fiction. So if I want to be a
right.
doctor, I could be that for a book or a chapter of a book. If I want to be an astronaut, I can be that for a book or a chapter of a book. And so by becoming a writer of fiction, I was able to live every possible life I ever dreamed of as a child. It's almost like it being an actor. You get to experience the same thing. You play a new role. And so that's really the joy of creating fiction. And so there are autobiographical aspects to what I write, of course, but I pride myself on having a vivid imagination, especially in my fiction. So it is all very made up.
Yeah. Yeah. We mentioned earlier that Mississippi has an interesting mix of authors and musicians, and pretty much any sort of performance art. The South produces some of the best. You wrote a book and published it in 2013. I think it was "Play Pretty Blues," which was a story about Robert Johnson,
Mhm.
another Mississippi native. What was it that drew you to his story?
The thing that drew me to Johnson wasn't necessarily his music, it was
Yeah.
his story. He is famous for having sold his soul to the devil at the crossroads.
Right,
And so in my investigation into his life, he didn't necessarily invent that story, but he didn't deny it. So in
right.
a lot of ways, he was like a true American in a way. He was a self-invented man. He's a Gatsby figure. And so I was drawn to that legend about him. And so when I decided to write a book about him, I needed to weigh in. And I was watching some show on the History Channel, maybe, and someone had a theory about why we know so little about his life. And that theory went that he went by different names and even had different wives throughout the South.
Yeah.
And so that was my key. I had my way in. And I've always been a big fan of
Oh, Snowden? Did we lose you? Oh, eh, hello? Eh, Snowden, are you there?
can you hear me?
Oh,
Can you see me?
yeah, yeah, yeah.
All
We
right.
we dropped out there for a second. You were saying you were talking about Robert Johnson's wives, and you said that was your entry point.
That was my entry point because that allowed me to explore his life through another viewpoint. And so his wives, they speak in unison in the novel. They speak in first person plural. And that's a point of view that really was put on the map by another Mississippian, William Faulkner, and his story A Rose for Emily.
Right.
He used it very well there. And then maybe next famously, it was used in The Virgin Suicides, the Jeffrey Eugenides novel. And it wasn't, for me, it wasn't a gimmick. It wasn't just a trick
Yeah.
because the crux of the novel is in their we. The fact that there are more than one wife meant he cheated on each one of them with the other one. And so it's
Right.
them coming to terms with their complicated love for this complicated man.
Yeah. That you in all of your novels, it seems to be that you have mined the reality to tell a fiction.
Mhm.
Where do you separate those in your mind? How do you take the things that we know and the concrete facts, and then spin them out in a fictional way? Like, where do you separate the real from where the fiction picks up?
Right. So because my first two novels are historical fiction,
Yeah.
that is an issue I had to grapple with. And you could argue that every story is about storytelling. And
Hmm.
so that's especially true of historical fiction, where if you hew too closely to the facts, it might as well be a biography or a work of
Sure.
nonfiction.
Sure.
But if you stray too far enough from them, then why are you using real figures in the first place? So you
Right.
have to toe that line. And that's always been fascinating for me with the Robert Johnson book and with my second novel, American Pop, which follows a family very similar to the Kennedys, but they're
Yeah.
not. And they have similar lives. And because they are this very wealthy family, it allowed for organic walk-ons of real historical figures because they would have encountered them.
Sure.
And oftentimes, a pitfall of historical fiction is that people would just have Harry Houdini walk through the room, even though that would be very
Right.
implausible.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it was a fascinating experience writing that book and just exploring the entire genre of historical fiction.
Yeah. Well, speaking of American Pop, what kind of what led you to the subject matter and the idea of you know the whole setup for this book? Like, where how do you get in that mind space?
Well, it's about a family who owns a soft drink company, very similar to Coca-Cola.
Right.
And often people will describe Coca-Cola as sugar water, as a pejorative. I find
Right.
that amazing that this multi-billion-dollar company is basically just sugar and bubbles.
Right.
And it is, in my opinion, the American drink. France has wine. England has what? Tea. America
Yeah.
has Coca-Cola. It has soda. And so that allowed me, by exploring this family and this business, to explore America. And so the book follows them through roughly 100 years of American history, the most foundational years, and their lives. I tried to make them emblematic of everything that was going on in the country, which obviously was a very easy task.
Yeah.
And but that was my goal with that novel.
Yeah. Well, when we come to the Queen City Detective Agency, we are dealing with a real place, in a real time, and with and the subject is fictional, but inspired by real events. And as anyone who grew up in this part of the country, um, you know that our last 50 years have been tumultuous, um, in parts, joyous in parts. It's a really interesting combination of emotions and interpersonal relationships that
Mhm.
happen in this part of the country. What was it that I, do I understand correctly that this was inspired by a real event or series of events, but doesn't necessarily tell that story?
It is absolutely inspired by real events, but it strays from the true story. So the impetus, the jumping off point for the book was a case my father tried when he was the district attorney in Meridian back in the 80s. And so there was this case where a woman had hired a man to kill her husband.
Yeah,
And the person who was on trial for that, Peanut Griffin was his name, he decided one day to break out of the county jail, only to realize that the county jail in Meridian is located on the roof of the county courthouse.
yeah.
And
Or it
so
was. That's
it
There's a
was,
new
yeah.
one now, but yeah, that
Hmm.
yeah, it was on top of the courthouse, right
Right.
next to a gallows that
Hmm.
hung there where they
Oh,
used to
really?
hang
I
people.
didn't know that.
Yeah, yeah. Anyway, but that's neither here nor there.
And
Yeah,
so he broke out of jail and he's up there on the roof in socks, boxer shorts, and a tank top, screaming to the people in the street below. And eventually the media catches wind and they got a film crew there. And he was threatening to kill my father. He was threatening to kill my mother. He was threatening to kill me. And that story always stuck in my head because you never forget your first death threat.
right.
And it was a part of family lore that
Yeah,
when my dad went up on the roof with his investigator and talked Peanut down. And so this book began with that incident and that entire case, but I fictionalized it. Sometimes for ethical reasons, other times for just story purposes to make it a better story. And and that really was foundational. Just the lore that I would hear about Meridian back in the 80s from my father over the dinner table, because of his job, crime was just, it was the weather. It was something
Right.
I was as aware of as the air. And that's why I was always a big reader of crime fiction as a kid. But this is my first foray into that particular genre.
Well, since you've written historical fiction in the past, and now
Mhm.
this is more crime fiction slash mystery, um, it bumps up against thriller
Mhm.
in a fun way. What made you want to shift gears to away from what you were writing to this style of story, which I would assume takes more preparation, in kind of pre-writing and laying out the way the story is going to unfold. Um, what was how was your process different in your planning for this book as opposed to your previous books?
The planning stage, I read up on the actual case, but after that, I had been planning for it my entire life in a way
Right.
because, as I mentioned, the history with my dad's job, but also I've read more books by Elmer Leonard than by any single author, and
Right.
so I knew how he handles a plot. And
Yeah.
even back in college, still my best friend. He's another writer, Matt Burgess, who's published two books with Doubleday, Uncle Janice and Dogfight, and they're both
Yeah.
literary crime novels. And so he and I had always bonded over our love for that genre. And it just took me a couple of books to get there, whereas he started off doing it. And he's always been my first reader, and he bounces ideas off me, and I bounce ideas off him. And it's been a very fortuitous friendship for me to take advantage of.
I love it. I love it. Um, how did you know you were ready to write this book? Because like you said, this was kind of story that you had been preparing all your life to write and you'd been collecting um, anecdotes and things that you were going to spin into the story. You wrote American Pop, you wrote the Robert Johnson book. How did you know that it was time for this one?
I was batting around ideas for what the next book would be. And I remember I was at this writing residency, and I get a voicemail from my mother.
Yeah.
And on it, she goes, "Someone tried to murder your father again. He's fine, but they haven't caught the guy. Apparently, he knows where you live, so lock your doors at night. Okay, love you. Bye." And I was like, "What? Hello, mom?"
W-
And so hearing that really made me think about my family history and how that would be something to explore. And then it just kind of worked out well, where I tried out the first chapter, liked how it turned out. My editor liked how it turned out, and I just moved on from there. And even I asked my mother about that voicemail a couple of months later, and she says to me, "Snowden, I've known your father for over 40 years. I understand good and well why somebody would want to kill him." And I'm sure that'll make it into a book someday. But it just made me realize that I was a good fit for this type of book.
Yeah. Let's talk about characters for a minute because the cast of characters that you've created for the story um, are um, are spot on and caricatures all at the same time. And I
Mhm.
mean that in the they are they are people that you would meet on the street and you think, "Oh, these can't be real people." And they are.
Mhm.
Which is, kind of one of the fun things about people that you meet in the South. Um how did you go about thinking about the characters for this book and the character of Clem, we can get into her in just a minute. But when you're thinking on the grand scale and everyone that's going to populate this story, how do you start kind of laying them out and deciding who's going to be where?
I really love it when I have a walk on character that I become fascinated by. And so then I'll try to explore their lives in a later chapter. And oftentimes that allows plot to arise from that. So, say there's a character that this is just a walk on part, but then I think, wait, there's more to this person's life than I've
Yeah.
put here. And so maybe I'll set a chapter from their point of view. And then I find out that actually they're very much involved with this plot. I don't want to give away any spoilers, but a lot of the twists and turns arose from character rather than setting or story. I think that's, for me, that's been a very valuable way to go about creating plots for crime novels and the thriller aspects, novels that were more plotted than your typical literary fiction.
Yeah.
And you're always trying to surprise the reader. And if you're not surprised, you can't expect the reader to be. And so that's always been the pleasure, is being surprised myself by the where the story goes. And yeah, and I've always liked having a large cast of characters. I love creating characters. I think it goes back to Elmore Leonard, who was basically a character factory.
Right.
And if you can create someone who represents a sort of, I don't want to say stereotype, but a foundational aspect of life or the South, but portray them in fresh and original ways, show them as being human beings. I think the best writers are able to do that. And so the best writers, they don't paint in shades of black and white, they paint in shades of gray. And if you could take, say, a hitman and portray him with this very like depressing, sad, but complicated home life, that's more interesting than just having someone who is a monster.
Right.
And same thing with any walk-on character. You got to make them human beings, because that's what they are.
Right. The central character in this book is Clementine Baldwin. Tell me where she came from, and what the thought process in creating a character with such an interesting background for this particular time.
With Clem, she's a young black woman, and so she's different from me. But I've always enjoyed writing from the point of view of people who are different from me. I know how
Yeah.
I think, and so I tried my best to get her right. I did my research. The main thing with creating her or with any character is you have to treat them with empathy, and
Mhm.
you also have to not resort to stereotypes or cliches. And that's when writers mess up, when they write across identity, say portraying from the point of view of a character of a different race, different gender, different sexuality, religion, whatever you want to,
Yeah.
however you want to go about it. And so it really just boils down to being a good writer. And I know that sounds a bit snarky, but when you're creating the character, treat them with empathy, but you should do that with every character. Don't
Right.
resort to stereotypes, but you should do that with every character. So be a good writer. Use these skills you should have for every aspect of your writing.
Yeah. There are aspects of the story, because we're writing about the past, and we're writing about times that we all hope that we have grown past and become more empathetic and better people.
Mhm.
That we don't fall into the types of behaviors that have happened in the past. Well, when you're writing about those behaviors and the mindset of people and the prejudices and all of the things that come, from any place's complicated history, um, when you write about them in a truthful way, um, it it has to be difficult to tell the truth of the past while not living there. Does that
Right.
make sense? Like wanting to be honest about what happened, while also recognizing that hopefully we're better people now than we once were.
True.
Could you talk a little bit about just balancing that and revisiting the painful parts of history, um, shining a light on it, but not backing down from the realities of what did happen?
Right. So it is difficult. I think there's a lot of trend in fiction these days to whitewash history, or
Right.
to pretend that, or just mollycoddle the reader a little bit too much. If you're going to be honest with the way things were and the way things oftentimes still are, you have to portray the good and the bad. And there was a lot of bad back then. There still is. And so I'm kind of on two minds where I understand the point of view of trigger warnings, things like that, to be careful and be sensitive to readers' issues. But on the other hand, I think that it can be infantilizing to the reader to assume that they can't handle seeing difficult things portrayed, to think that they are such babies that we have to spoon feed them a fairy tale reality. And the
Right.
world has trouble. And so I think mature readers can handle seeing that portrayed if you treat the subject matter in a mature way. And that can be difficult, and oftentimes writers get it wrong. But you have to be willing to take risk, and you have to be willing to put in the work, and you also have to be willing to listen to criticism. So if you get it wrong and people tell you, you have to listen. And
Right.
so hopefully I did it well. I think so. I had trusted readers who looked at it and gave me tips and advice, which I took seriously. And so it can be difficult at times, but hopefully, maybe it's just me, but I try to leaven the darker subject matter with a little bit of humor. So this book might sound pretty bleak after what we've been talking about, but there are a lot of jokes in it. So I hope
Well,
readers understand that.
that was going to be the next aspect that I brought up, is that you can bring a lot of serious discussion to a topic, especially if you inject a little levity in it, lighten the mood. There's a lot of there's a lot of funny that happens in dark times. There's there's almost a gallows humor that comes with a lot of painful situations. And all of the humor in this book doesn't come directly out of painful situations, but it's the truth of the highs and lows of life. And it's a lot of fun to read in places. You know, I don't know. You've done a great job of mixing the emotions, the emotional roller coaster that we go on in this book.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. It's been a going back to my family. We are a family that appreciates a good joke, and I think
Yeah.
that's how we deal with a lot of difficult trauma. I mentioned earlier about that recent assassination attempt on my father, and I was thinking back when the police went to him. They said, "Well, sir, can you think of anybody who'd want to kill you?" And without missing a beat, he goes, "I can think of three." You got to be a real piece of work to have three people out there who might want to kill you. And
Right.
so we had a good laugh about that. And it's just, that's how I go about my fiction. That's how I go about my life. And
Yeah.
so I think I wish more crime novels these days were funnier. There's
Right.
a lot of pretty bleak ones. And I think I understand why they are. We've been through some bleak times, but oftentimes that's when you need to have some funny.
Right. Absolutely. Snowden, the thing um, that I'm fascinated most with storytelling is the moment of creation. In one moment in time, a book like the Queen City Detective Agency did not exist at all, and then either a character walks onto the stage of your mind, and you start asking yourself, "Well, who is this, and what is she up to?" And then the what if game starts playing, or maybe you're thinking about things that happened in your past, and you start thinking, well, I wonder if I change this, and that you start playing the what if game and think this thing leads to another thing, and then all of a sudden this book does exist, and then it's your job as the author to dig it out of the ground and excavate it and dust it off and polish it up, and then the book does exist. What is that first moment of creation like for you for any new book project?
For me, it really comes down to the story. A lot of people start with character, which is great, but I think you need to either start with character or story, and that can swap out one way or the other. For me, it's often story. I get, I've taught writing in the past, and oftentimes students run into trouble when they start out with a lesson they're trying to get across. They're like,
Right.
this book is going to show that racism is bad. It's like, that's fine for a book to do that. But when you start out from that point, you lose a lot of storytelling. That should come through in the storytelling and through the characters and through the characterizations. So for me, it starts out with, how can I tell this in the most entertaining way? And so I
Right.
wrote the first two paragraphs of the book, which are about the jailbreak of the character's name is Turnip Coogan in the book. And I tried to tell it in the most entertaining way. And once I got that on the page, I was off to the races. I knew where I was going, where these characters was going, and where the book was going.
I love it. The Queen City Detective Agency comes out in August of this year. We're going to put links in the show notes of this episode where you can pre-order it from Amazon, or when the book comes out, go visit your local bookstore, support local books. Snowden, I love this book. I'm recommending it to everyone this summer. If people are just discovering you and want to dig into all the great stuff that you're up to and follow along for new news, is there a place online where they can follow you?
Sure. I have a website, snowdenwright.com. And very fortunately, I happen to have a very Googleable name. So if you want to find where I am online, just type that in there.
Excellent. We'll link up all that stuff in the show notes and make it easy for folks to find you. The Queen City Detective Agency out later this summer. Go grab your copy. Snowden, thank you so much for taking time to drop by the show today.
Thank you so much for having me.